So good afternoon, everybody. This next session, in case you're not sure where you are, is financing opportunities for ATMP companies. And we've got a great panel who I will talk about very briefly in a second, but they're going to tell you a lot more about themselves. When we first got involved in this conference about 5 years ago, one of the reasons for it was to test the waters, introduce ATMPs to a broader range of investors. And when we tested the temperature 5 years ago, it was definitely very, very cold. But now I think things have changed, and I think we're going to hear over the course of the next few minutes, hour or so, quite some exciting stories, judging by the sort of preparation calls that I've had. The format for what we're going to do is we've got about 5 subjects that have come out of the discussion that we want to sort of home in on for a brief period of time. One of the panel will introduce that and introduce themselves. At the end of each one of those, or during that session, really would like to encourage you, and the panel would like to encourage you to engage and ask questions, okay? Because we're then going to move on from that subject to something else. So please do ask questions along the way. All I'm going to do now is just give you the names, put the names to the people, because I know you can't read the badges from the bottom. But first of all, Genghis Lloyd-Harris, Jasper, Paolo, Siviero, and Chris Hollowood, in that order. Okay. So the first of the subjects was finance is it's a market, right? And I remember standing up or being part of a presentation at a conference a few years ago where somebody was banging the table saying we need to force the investors to invest, which was exactly my reaction. It just doesn't happen that way. You can't make it that way. There's 2 things that need to be there. There needs to be some money around the place, and there needs to be some investment opportunities in order for there to be an active market. So we're going to start with the investment opportunities side of things. And Chris Hollowood is going to introduce that. So Chris, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Tell us a little bit about Syncona, and kick off with the subject of, is there a discussion to have? Is there other things to invest in?
I hope so. Keep the introduction very brief. So Chris Hollowood, originally a Ph.D. organic chemist, a couple of years in the pharmaceutical industry, but really been doing early stage life science investing for the last 15 years, always based out of London, but invested in Europe and in the US as well. I work for a group called Syncona, not partners anymore, Syncona Limited. We are a company listed on the London Stock Exchange, currently worth about £1.2 billion. We have about £1 billion worth of assets, which is a mixture of £400 million worth of life science investments and £600 million of cash or near cash. Our plan is to build that from the 7 portfolio companies we currently have to around 15 to 20 and invest in those companies on a long-term basis to build standalone businesses. So that's us. In terms of our strategy, we invest in things to be a significant shareholder at the point of product approval. Everything flows from there. The reason we like cell and gene therapy is because it has high clinical utility in some very devastating diseases, so small companies can aspire to take products all the way to market. So of that £400 million worth of NAV, about 300 is currently in cell and gene therapy companies. So we're a big, big investor in it. In terms of investment opportunities, absolutely. I do see the cell and gene therapy, and I'm probably preaching to the choir in this room, but I do see cell and gene therapy as a modality that is going to deliver tens of drugs at the minimum. And when you get a modality that is genuinely going to deliver drug formats and can get to diseases where other modalities cannot get to, then something big is happening. And so we see lots of opportunities like that. And we've done 7 and we'll continue to build. My fear is that Europe, in the translational sense and the basic science sense, is every bit at the forefront of that. I spent a lot of time in the gene therapy side of it, less so on the cell therapy side. And if you look at those indications that have shown clinical proof of concept, the first person to show it in the majority of them was a European clinician. Yet all the companies are being built in the US. And what we need to be careful of here is not doing what we've done in the past of putting 10 million quid down against something that's really exciting for 3 years, turning the card on 1 clinical study, and then putting the next amount of money in. The competitors in the US are getting balance sheets together at 200 and 300 million pounds, and something half as good with 10 times the money will still probably win and buy your thing. So we need to be ambitious. Money is as cheap as it's ever been. You need to go out, raise it, and raise it in large amounts to win.
Interesting. Does everybody agree with that? There's plenty of investment opportunities? Genghis?
Yeah, I just think there's a rich flow, actually.
Yeah.
I was wondering, I haven't seen the data on the Europeans, Europeans leading the discovery. I'd love to see. Okay, yeah, very, very. But no, there are a huge number of companies being started up on both sides of the Atlantic.
Jasper, you're nodding as well. Yeah.
I mean, definitely. If you look at, I mean, part of it has to do with the financing climate right now. If you compare the financing climate right now, and that's where I'm trying to challenge Chris a little bit, is actually if you compare the financing climate right now with 5 years ago. 5 years ago.
We're going to come back onto the models.
I mean, 5 years ago, you would come up with a business plan and you would try to raise 5 million in a seed. And a VC would say, whoa, man, come on. I mean, first raise 2 million, and by the way, we're going to trench it in 10 different trenches of 200K. Because we want to be absolutely, we are risk averse because we're venture capitalists. Right now, 5 years later, you actually see business plans, especially in immuno-oncology, but also cell therapy, where people are very much willing in a seed stage opportunity, as long as it's immuno-oncology, to put up 30, 35 million in a Series A, which doesn't have any proof whatsoever, but it's simply being able to allocate your capital already for the future. So I think go out and raise the money. That's definitely true. But thinking big, I think people are forced to think bigger now than they used to be. Okay.
And we're going to come back to that theme. I'm going to come back to the theme of how the investors are interested in going about investing in a little while, because I think we have got this divergent approach here, which is healthy. There are different opportunities for different courses. But the other side of the sort of making sure that there is a market for investment is the supply of money. And a couple of you already said that there is quite a lot of funding available. And Genghis, so I'm going to ask you to do the same thing, introduce yourself, introduce Abingworth, and then just tell us just exactly how much money there is out there and give us some examples.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. I'm not sure I can give you a precise figure, but to the nearest 5 billion.
Well then.
So I'm a partner at Abingworth, and we have offices here in London and in Boston and Menlo Park. We have about $1.5 billion of assets under management. And we like cell and gene therapy a lot, so we're investors in CRISPR Therapeutics, GenSight, and Gamma Delta Therapeutics. And I'll just give you some of our recent transactions to give you a flavour for what we do. Our most recent IPO was Verona, an AIM-listed company. They did an IPO on NASDAQ and raised $90 million. They could never have raised that capital in Europe. Our most recent M&A transaction was IFM Therapeutics, an East Coast company that was bought by Bristol Myers Squibb for $300 million up front and $2 billion in milestones. Our most recent collaboration was Gamma Delta Therapeutics with Takeda, and I'll come back to that because it's very relevant to this audience in this forum. And our most recent venture investment was announced just earlier this week in Newscom, an Italian cancer vaccine company. So it gives you a flavour for the sort of things that we do. So where are we in the cycle of financing? What is available out there? Well, there's a few things we can look at to give us some yardsticks as to where we are. And one of the benchmarks, of course, is always IPOs. And if you look in the first 9 months of this year, there have been 42 biotech IPOs on Western exchanges, and there were 43 for the first 9 months of last year. So pretty decent IPO market, not spectacular, but that's more than one IPO a week. If you look at venture funding into biotech specifically, it's pretty steady in terms of number of deals. It's always around 110, plus or minus 10% per quarter. And that hasn't changed. And the dollar numbers, if you looked at some of the articles in the press, you might think we had a spectacular quarter in Q3, but it was distorted because, talk about large Series A's, Roivant raised $1.1 billion in a Series A. And if you take that out, then the numbers are pretty consistent. So the VC market is steady, it's vibrant, plenty of deals getting done, as alluded to earlier. Collaborations, this is the good news. Collaborations are up. If you look at the first 9 months of this year, it's well above what it was in 2016 and 2015. There were 740 biopharma collaborations first 9 months of this year. On the other hand, do you want some bad news?
Yeah. Keep it balanced.
M&A, unfortunately, is down, and it's down a heck of a lot. So if you look at this, the average number of quarterly M&A deals is about 56 for the last decade. Now, if you look at Q2, there were only 29 deals. Look at Q3, there were only 31 deals. They're the worst 2 quarters in the last decade. What is happening? Why has pharma stopped buying these companies? Is it a temporary blip? Are they waiting for some tax reforms from the Trump administration? Or do they think, as some have said, that the health of the IPO market makes M&A more difficult because companies have an alternative to go out and raise money on the public market, and so they can say no thanks to a particular M&A offer? I actually don't know, and if you talk to farmers, they all give waffly answers that I don't think they know either. But 1 quarter, well, we thought that could be a bit of variation. 2 quarters starts to look like a trend. I'm praying it's going to be better in the final quarter, but I really don't know. And why that matters is because although there is a loose inverse correlation between IPOs and M&A, it is pretty loose, it's subtle, it varies. But if M&A is down, and if this healthy IPO market were to go away, then suddenly we're in a very difficult situation. Mm-hmm. And we as venture capitalists always like to say we invest regardless of what's happening in the IPO markets because we're long-term investors and so on. But it does colour how you do your valuation of a company. If all the comparables have got lower valuations, it's going to affect how you view it. So it is important. And so I think, nobody, if you talk to investment bankers, at the beginning of this year, they were all optimistic it was going to be a bumper year for M&A. Now, maybe investment bankers are bound to be optimistic anyway. But so they've all been surprised. But actually, if you talk to any individual pharma company, they seem pretty surprised too. So I don't know what to make about that. I think the other thing is financing is related to what's going on in the market. And at this forum last year, we thought that over the next 12 to 24 months, we might see 2 or 3 gene or cell therapies approved. Well, in only 12 months, and we've already had 2 cell therapies approved, and it looks like Spark's gene therapy might get approved very soon. So, we're way ahead of schedule, and that should be good. So that's about the general market. Now let's look specifically at our universe of cell and gene companies. And there's some great statistics here that the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine puts on their website. And if you haven't, they have lots of free stuff. And here they've done a summary of the financings. So if you look at gene therapy and gene-modified cell therapy, so Kymriah is a gene-modified cell therapy, then there's a 56% increase in the financings over the same quarter last year. And if you look at plain vanilla cell therapy, there's a 70% increase in financings. The money is there. The money is coming in. Mm-hmm. And these statistics, gathered by ARM, support that. And we're seeing some very interesting corporate partnerships too. So perhaps I'll just come back to the one I alluded to, Gamma Delta Therapeutics. And at this forum last year, I talked about Gamma Delta Therapeutics, and it was a new deal, hot off the press, a gleam in a professor's eye, Adrian Hayday. Well, they've subsequently done a buy-to-build with Takeda, where $100 million goes in, and Takeda has an option to acquire the company at any time over the next 4 years at a pre-agreed price. We did it that way because we couldn't work out what the milestones were going to be. It was so early, so nebulous, But the point there is that we weren't actually looking to do a build to buy. We thought we'd do a fairly conventional partnership, but there was so much interest, and so then Takeda stepped up and went, beyond the others that we were talking to. So there are lots of signs of vibrancy, of public market money being available, venture money being available, money for collaborations being available, and M&A, well, that's the one I keeps me up at night.
So let me bring the rest of the panel in on that then. So the M&A is not there. Do you have any insights into that? I mean, is it that they're not ready yet? They're just not interested in this space yet? Or is it that they haven't got the skills?
I mean, I think it's a general trend because it's not M&A in this field, it's M&A everywhere. And I know at least 2 or 3 major pharma companies that are actually in quite some turmoil with respect to senior leadership. So, and having been the victim of that actually a few times now in our portfolio, I think that probably is sort of a sort of a perfect storm coming together. We've seen that early in the year, BMS, of course, very famously, a few hedge funds started to influence the course of BMS. A month later, BMS had a new head of R&D. That, of course, will influence where BMS is going. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, and that's just one example. We recently saw, of course, here locally, GSK, that was this week. And changing heads of R&D has a huge impact on the strategic direction. So I think that is one anecdotal one, but it's indicative of a change in pharma industry in general.
Yeah, well, no, okay. I mean, from my own experience, having been a corporate financier and doing M&A, our clients would be waiting for the markets to go down and for everything to dry up, because that's when the bargains come. So it may not be a problem. It may just be something that comes along later on.
I agree. I mean, valuations have to count. I mean, the sort of valuations we're seeing now are, 15 years ago, you just wouldn't be able to touch. That has to impact on M&A. I think the other aspect is, for this forum, is a lot of farmers don't get it yet. And so you look on the cell therapy side of it, it's autologous, they don't have the delivery systems up, they've got to make investments there, they've got to get their head around it, it's not what they're used to. On the gene therapy side, they're either looking at incident populations where the sales numbers are going to be small, or they're looking at prevalence populations where the sales curves go up and straight back down again, and they can't get their head around that either. So some of these companies are not yet ready to make the leap, the strategic leap to pay to get into this field. But when one goes, it'd be interesting to see after the Kai acquisition, when one goes, how many follow?
Yes, also, I just want, if I may add, just there is also another aspect that we have not yet a clear vision about how these products will be incorporated in the therapeutic standards of care, and how the public sector will be able to pay for this product. So the debate that has been done also this morning about the sustainability, I think that is another issue that at the moment influence also the M&A.
So do you, I would see that being kind of glass half full kind of guy. I would see that as opportunity for the VC market. If these guys are staying out, you've got the opportunity to go in there and play and build. And when the time comes, you have a portfolio ready for them to take off your hands.
So, and capital's there.
Yeah.
So you're not waiting for them.
And coming back to this question of capital, then is it in balance? I started looking at my first job in 1987, the summer of 1987, signed a contract in the autumn of 87, and then the whole world stock market's completely collapsed, which I kind of was a lesson for me and sensitized me to trends and frothiness. But we're not in that situation here, are we? Are we in a situation where, or are we? That's because it's important for people to understand, because it changes your relationship with the funding organisation. Yeah.
Well, until the recent correction, the biotech index was at 25-26%, and now it's been corrected because of the big caps stumbling on their projections. So that's going to change the valuations, I think, across the board for a while. It's always a feast or famine, isn't it? And so when you've got the valuations look very high today compared to historical. But on the other hand, when you get new therapies approved and if revenues start coming in, they're going to look reasonable.
So let's move on to that then. Sorry, any questions from the floor at all? Anybody want to ask anything while we're here? No? We're going to move on to another area, and I know there was somebody who actually asked me this question earlier on, so if you want to dive in. There has been a lot of activity. You mentioned some of it. Jane put some on the board earlier on this morning. And undoubtedly that will have affected the dynamics of the way that the funding market is going, both positively or negatively. So I would ask each one of you to pull out an example of something that happened in the last 12 months that you think has changed the dynamic of what is going on in the marketplace. So if it is frothy, is it something that's driven the frothiness? If it's cautious and dropped back, what are the things that have knocked it back to date?
Well, Kymriah was a big event. The first gene therapy. The FDA classifies it as gene therapy. It's both a gene and a cell therapy, and but that was that's going to be the beginning, I think, of many tens of products, as you said, and maybe over time many more than that. But there's always been skepticism. There's so many gene therapy products in phase 3. But now with the Siviero approval and then the second approval and with Spark coming up, I think that's transformational.
And you're seeing that amongst your investors? In terms of the funds you go to, are they conscious of that, or are they just looking at your...
We're educating them.
Right. No, but that's part of the purpose of this meeting, and I was reminded at a loyalty brief conversation I had at lunchtime, how there is a danger that we become parochial on this, and that we have to get that message out about what the opportunity is, because sometimes you walk into a room...
But it made the front page of the New York Times, and so...
Yeah.
I mean, that is the defining event of the last 12 months. These things are, people thought they were real. They're real now. And the unifying truth of our sector is a good product is a good product. So you talk about frothiness or whatever. This is not 2000, because 2000 it was tech and it was a hope and it was a business plan and something that was going to... No, there's real product in that stuff.
Good.
And so there are companies whose valuations are ahead of where they should be. There are companies that will fall over. There will be a correction if money gets more expensive, all that stuff, but it won't be a correction down to zero because there's real product in it.
Yeah, I think the addition to that is that once there is a regulatory approval path forward, there is potentially a reimbursement path forward, which also means that the interest from bigger pharma companies to try to fit novel therapies in their existing business model, that they will start to realize that is actually possible. I know quite a lot of bigger pharma companies that historically shied away from very novel therapeutic modalities simply because of that reason. And I think what you will see then is that you see more drive in also maybe even into M&A, which then leads again to renewed investor interest. So I think that all will catalyze, hopefully, everything that's going on.
It's not dissimilar to how antibodies went.
Exactly.
People stood on the sidelines, then antibodies were successful. Companies that were successful antibodies, valuations went through the roof. Yeah. Those who were left behind started paying massive amounts to get the capability.
Yeah, the only problem, I think, that could be the process, how the process will be more scalable, and how the process could be easier to be included in the standards of the healthcare sectors. That is the other aspect that I think that will be challenging, and that we will learn in the future. And
I'm going to make a sort of unapologetic plug for both our organisation and our funding organisation, Innovate UK, because they actually recognise this, and there's an initiative in the UK where they're trying to develop, or intending to develop, and go through the process of awarding at the moment, 3 centres in the UK, specifically around trying to get the clinical experience, the experience of using the practice of using these drugs, and the follow-up and the databases and ultimately the payment for those. And one of the things that I have, having observed that process, and one of my colleagues is running it, been amazed by has been the engagement of the pharma companies in that, because they've all gone, you know what, we want to be part of changing it, and we don't want to do it all by ourselves. So I think there are some interesting initiatives that we'll start to sort that out over the course of the next few years, I hope.
Yeah, it is important. I mean, I'm so pessimistic about Brexit, but one of the few bright spots is what's going on at the Catapult and what we're doing in cell and gene therapy here.
There's a huge commitment to the sector, without a doubt.
And I think maybe, Matt, to add to one of the big things that happened actually last month, and that will drive these kind of therapies more to mainstream and more to adoption by big pharma, is of course the acquisition of Kite by Gilead, because for now, for the first time, you have a huge pharma company that is truly committing with a significant chunk of their cash, and that's truly committing to therapies that require a completely different business model. And because they put so much money behind, because they are a huge organization, that means that there will be solutions for things that we now regard as maybe close to insurmountable problems.
So Peter Nolan should take note. That's a benchmark for your valuation, for your take-up, right?
It's only $13 billion.
Oh, I think there's a few people in the room looking at the $13 billion valuation that's been quite reasonable, really. Any other examples or any questions from the floor with respect to what we've been talking about, or with respect to the events in the last year or so? Jason. Is there a mic? Or is it?
So we see quite a lot of cell and gene therapy companies from Europe seeking to list in the US. Does the panel think that European stock exchanges are going to catch up with their US peers?
Well,
Is that a one-word answer?
Quite a few in Europe as well.
Yeah.
And GenSight is one, but there's actually quite a long list. I would say that Europe probably punches above its weight in terms of the number because it was so small compared to the US. But often a European listing can be a stepping stone to a US listing. The Nightstar RX went straight to the US. And I think if you've got a good enough story and you can go straight to the US, that's a very good thing to do.
I'll give one little anecdote on this. So I've got a few Americans on the Nightstar board, and I sat in that board meeting and I said, you've got to do a European roadshow. I said, I cannot sit at a conference on a panel telling people that a company that was built here didn't give European investors an opportunity to invest. So they did, and they spent a week in Europe, and that book was 5 times oversubscribed. Didn't get a single European order. Zero. Yep. Other than us, zero.
Wow.
So I think, that you can do it here, but I think it's a stepping stone.
Yeah.
I think in order to get the capital to win, to be a globally competitive company right now, NASDAQ is the place to do it because that's where your competitors are. And if you're trying to compete in a market where you can't get as much money as them and your cost of capital is different to them, it's incredibly hard.
Okay, just park that thought for a minute because that's actually leading into the next one of the themes, if you like, in terms of this whole structural relationship and the European investor. But Alex, you had a question.
Yeah, just a follow-on question. Clearly a lot of enthusiasm about the technology, but to what extent do amongst others, the discussion we just had on the other panel on reimbursement and the more societal drive for drug prices, to what extent does that play a role in the way you view this market and perhaps put a little bit more of a damper on your enthusiasm there? Can you shed some light?
So I'm not enthusiastic about cell and gene therapy because it's cell and gene therapy. I'm enthusiastic about cell and gene therapy because of the clinical results that have been seen from using it. And that's important because that leads directly onto reimbursement. I get so fed up reading about what's the reimbursement going to be for gene therapy, what's the reimbursement going to be for cell therapy. It's irrelevant. It's like going, what's the reimbursement for an antibody? It matters what that thing does in the clinical setting it's being used, and that will guide reimbursement. So on a value basis, I feel very comfortable. The difficulty is the structure. And if you're curing patients or it's one-time therapy, as Jasper pointed out, right now the reimbursement systems aren't set up to deal with that properly. So it's the structure, not the value, that I worry about, and that is unresolved, and I think that remains a real risk.
Having been a payer before my role in a venture capital fund, well, I think that there should be really a responsibility also by the ventures about having in mind the sustainability of the system. I totally agree with you that the first goal is to get the product available on the market, but there should be also a clear view that the product should arrive to the market with a structure of value that is sustainable for the food.
That would be great, but for anyone in this room, Spark's going to do it and you're going to learn. Kite's going to do it and you're going to learn. So we're going to have some data points to learn from, so when we arrive, hopefully we've learned.
Yeah, and I think the beauty is that, legislation always follows technology. And never the other way around, which means that if there's enough push with new therapies that can really make a difference, reimbursement agencies will have catch-up to play. Because simply it's socially unacceptable to not think about it and to not give patients a chance if there is if these therapies are truly differentiating. And to me, to echo your point, Chris, that's for us is the key point is this enough of a differentiator, and are you able to prove that this is going to be a differentiator? And if the answer to those two is yes, I'm firmly believing that you will be able with a well-differentiated product that captures a lot of unmet medical need, you will be able to find reimbursement.
That's kind of the fundamental that keeps us all in this space, because it's hard work sometimes. But there's still, you lose a lot of value through friction there. And, there's a lot of things that take, you've got to change the system. You've got to get, and one of the things that I think is very positive in the development of the industry right now, in fact, is the way that the industry is coming together to share that burden of change, rewiring the healthcare system to some extent. I talked earlier on about the one about the actual clinical use. There are another couple of initiatives going on where companies are getting together to talk to the healthcare systems about this issue. And the healthcare systems, to their credit, 5 years ago we went through the door of NICE and said, these things are coming. And they, after they were shocked that somebody came to talk to them, they said, well, tell us all about it. And we've seen that move on now, past NICE into the actual NHS and the healthcare system. So it may not happen in time, but there's preparation work going on as well. So I think I'm quite positive about the ability to change the dynamics of the market. But it's going to cost you. So I think it's a fair question that actually, you know what, the value's there, but you've still got to recognise that there's going to be some discount for the fact that it's all quite new and people have got to get used to it.
But the other thing is big pharma companies are no longer embarrassed by high sticker prices.
No, that's
so,
true.
GSK, Strinvelis, 600,000 euros. If you go back 15 years ago, GSK had a product called Flolan for pulmonary hypertension. It was $100,000 a year, and they kept it very secret because they were so embarrassed about that price. And Novartis, these high prices are no longer causing embarrassment to the big pharma companies.
It's interesting. It's good. It's positive. And you can see how this at the end of the day, it's a food chain. If you're not going to get paid for your product, there's not going to be any investment at the other end of it in the development of the product. And it's good that these things are shaping up. I'd like to take, unless there's another immediate question, I'm going to take us on to the next subject, which was really playing on something that Chris introduced there. And this is one for Silvio, Paolo, to pick up on and tell us a little bit about himself as well. But this theme of if you really want to get the money, you've got to go to the States. Or, is that really the case? I mean, are there some new models emerging in terms of European funding? Chris, I would sort of kind of describe Syncona as a new model in some way, shape, or form. But and I, in the conversations that we had in preparation for this meeting, people were talking about the fact that there was more funding coming in at an earlier stage in terms of the relationship, and it's a departure from what you highlighted at the beginning, Chris, which is the sort of here's $1 million, come back with the exact proof of what you said you were going to do, and I might give you another $1 million. The drip feeding side of things. Is there a new relationship developing? Can a new relationship develop?
Well, probably my funds is an example of this changing in the environment, because this is a small venture capital funds compared to the others that are on the stage, but it is the largest Italian venture capital funds dedicated to the healthcare sector. So probably there is a trend that in a way enable also investors to invest in specialized funds and to create a better environment also for small investments. On the other side, I think that there are also some activity that is done by the European investment funds to try to facilitate and to create and to make some also public funds available for this kind of activity. So I think that there is still a need to have an early stage money available. That is still, there is still a lack on that. But then for the other part, I think the European environment is getting mature also compared to the US one. Probably also because the environment, there is a better understanding also about the needs of the public sector to try to sustain the development of new products and new therapies. What is happening between between regulators and payers in Europe is something that is not at all possible in the US context. But for investors, it's absolutely necessary and important to understand if the product will get the market at the end and how it will get. So I think that this kind of environment is facilitating also the trust of investors in the sectors.
Chris, is it Can we do it? Can the European mentality change to get to be the big investor?
I think there's been a lot of positive steps. Yeah. You know, and I think the Series A's you see are a lot bigger than they were 5 years ago, and all this kind of stuff. But we've really stepped it up, and the US have really stepped it up as well. So we've caught where they were, and now they're doing hundreds, and we're doing tens. So it's we just need to be careful, and at the end, you've just got to make sure the company has a balance sheet that it can deliver the right plan, and it's not having its plan clipped because it can't raise the capital. And I think there's enough money in Europe. This is the most money I've ever seen in Europe. So there is enough money in Europe to do it. And a world-class business can attract global capital. So just because you're here doesn't mean all your capital's got to come from here as well. So the money is there for the good stories, and you've got to have the plan needs to be coherent and ambitious enough to attract that money.
Jasper?
I somewhat agree and somewhat disagree, because right now there's indeed more money out there than there ever was probably. Yeah. And you see behavior in syndicates that is more elbowing than I've ever seen in the past 12 to 14 years. So in that sense, there is, for the right deals, there is a ton of money. Unfortunately, a lot of deals are not at the stage yet of being the right deals for the majority of VCs. So what you see in the very early stage, let's say hit stage chemistry, completely novel biology, you still see that there's a handful of investors that are willing to step in that early and that have the ability to follow on with the company. Because what you don't want to have is, to Chris's point, is to have a company that gets there halfway, that gets there with a preclinical plan that doesn't give you all the answers simply because there was not enough money. And as an early stage investor, that's something we sometimes struggle with. In order to get those kind of deals financed in the proper way without taking too much exposure ourselves.
Well, you were telling me earlier, talk about seed deals. You're doing pre-seed deals. I said, well, what's a pre-seed deal?
Well, true, but we syndicate them already from early on, and we do that especially because we don't want to be. We've been in many companies, and talk a little bit more about that later. But we've been in many companies where we were a majority shareholder and the only investor, and then having to do the rounds. It has cured me from the ambition to ever become a CEO. Let me put it that way. It's different.
So if we've got lots of money around the place, and we've got people going in earlier and earlier and earlier, and we've got some changes to the dynamics of the market. Does the process as an investor, and I'm going to point this one at you, Jasper, the process as an investor, is it any different? Is the due diligence process for this industry and the preparation by the company, is it different? Should they be doing different things? Should they be doing other things earlier? Or is it just the same old stuff? Yeah, Tell us a little bit about
I think it's a very interesting question, but let me first briefly introduce Merck Ventures to you. I'm Jasper. I'm heading the healthcare fund at Merck Ventures. Merck Ventures is a 300 million evergreen fund linked to Merck, German Merck. We have, in essence, 4 different types of funds, which span all the different divisions of Merck. So we're able to invest in performance materials. So I can see some people looking at their iPhones. All the liquid crystals in the screens were actually made by Merck. Of course, Merck is the owner of Sigma Aldrich, Merck Millipore. So we also invest in life sciences. We invest in digital. And since 2009, we have been investing in healthcare as a strategic investor. As I said, we are a very early stage investor. We prefer to invest seed or even before. As a result, I would say 1/3 of our portfolio are companies that we founded ourselves. And I think that's a very nice way of working that has actually set us apart from quite a number of other corporate funds, and has also allowed us to grow this fund from 40 million, what we were in 2009, to 300 million right now. And just to give you an indication of the type of companies we invest in, it always has to be first in class. We are very biology focused, so always focused on novel biology. Last year, for instance, quite a large exit was Padlock. to BMS. Very novel way of looking at inflammation. Epitherapeutics was another one. Was the first company focused on histone demethylases. Here in the UK, we're for instance recently invested in Storm Therapeutics, so Tony Kotsouridis' new company. So very heavily focused around that. And to go back to your question, I think the diligence process for ATMP companies necessarily for investors needs to be a little bit different, because you're not only asking questions about, is the biology going to work? Is this going to be, how do I fit this into a standard drug discovery framework? Because simply put, it doesn't. And it raises a whole new bar, because you're not only talking about questions around science, you're also talking about questions around logistics, scalability. Is this actually going to work on a grander scheme if I have to make personalized therapies? How am I going to have to deal with QA, QC if I'm doing something that's completely individual? How am I going to deal with all of the logistics? How am I going to keep my cost of goods low enough? And I think that's something that you will see with, especially with less sophisticated investors. There are, especially here around the table, a few people that have done a number of deals in this space. But if you speak to some other investors, they will shy away from these kind of opportunities because it's more difficult to fit in their natural small molecule / antibody drug discovery framework. And I think that is something which makes it for us very, very interesting to actually take a look at. Delivery, of course, is still a huge issue. Translatability of animal models is also in this field is typically different. So I think it's just added layers of complexity. And I think especially, Chris, I mean, you've done many investments in this space. And before, when you were still with Apposite, you were doing more regular type investments. So you're probably best positioned to give your opinion on this.
Yeah, I mean, the manufacturing delivery aspects of it are just very different. And so relative to something you might be looking at 5 years ago, you're very focused on that. I think there are other aspects of it that are de-risked. I think in the gene therapy space, it allows you to deliver a protein to a compartment of the body in a monogenic recessive disorder. I mean, I don't know any simpler biology than that. So the biology is being de-risked, the risks are being displaced elsewhere. Equally, the model of getting something into a clinical trial in the phase 1/2 setting in a cell therapy is a lot easier than a small molecule or an antibody or a gene therapy. So there's a lot in that where you can actually iterate products, which I don't think you could do before. So there are the risks on balance, you weigh them up, but there are bigger risks in different areas than they were to other business models that have predated gene and cell therapy.
And given that it's such a new industry, where do you go for the knowledge?
Well, so we've had this strategy of where we found interesting areas to make multiple investments. So we have a lot of domain knowledge within Syncona about, and some terrific people as well. So when we do a new gene therapy deal, I will use the CSOs, the head of manufacturing, et cetera, from my other portfolio companies. And, Jan Furkettel, for instance, I don't think there is many people better than him. So, those are the sorts of people using to do the diligence. So I think through our model, we've been able to access the expertise we need. When we started out with Nightstar, it was a lot harder, and luckily I'm seeing Dave Venables in the audience here. Luckily, we met David Venables, and he really helped us on that aspect. Without that sort of guidance, that company would be a lot slower off the launch pad.
And Genghis, have you changed your approach for this sector? You've come into it now.
Well,
3 or 4 years ago, it was...
Well, in general, we're doing a lot
outside.
more early-stage deals. So I think 5 of our last 6 deals have been preclinical or phase 1, mostly preclinical. And, we want to do more and more in cell and gene therapy. I think, the manufacturing diligence is much more complicated. And then that's probably the hardest aspect. The science is relatively straightforward, as you say, but the manufacturing processes are just so...
that's interesting. So it's no longer all just about the science.
No.
So, Paolo?
I totally agree. The manufacturing is one of the things that that is more complicated than than in the other sectors, and also because the scalability of them is something that should be understood, and the interaction with hospitals and so on. There are more aspects that are still unclear, and so should be developed in the future, I think.
Okay. Any questions from the floor at all? Anybody? A couple up there at the back.
Thank you. So I'm actually very interested in the M&A, so if I might go briefly back to the M&A. So I like Jasper when he said that, and I totally agree, that M&A are not just down in this field, but in general. As a comment, I would say that it might be that M&A tend to fail, and there is evidence out there saying that in general tend to fail. And I'd like your opinion on that. And then the other point is that what can we do about it as CEOs of biotech in this space, or in general as venture capitalists? So is there a secret recipe? Because we've seen the guide deal, and again, Jasper mentioned, we've seen the gamma delta CT with Takeda. We're probably going to see GSK with Adaptimmune. So is there a secret recipe to increase this number?
You want to take that?
Yeah. I mean, of course, my secret recipe I'm not going to share. But other than that, I mean, I think the key is to recognize, especially in these kind of, let's call it more advanced therapies, is that your partner is not advanced as your company. So you have a disbalance in knowledge, and you have a disbalance in mindset. And the only way, I mean, speaking from the Merck side, Merck has a large partnership with Intrexon, for instance. And what you can see in all of these kind of partnerships is that as a pharma company, I think you need to be a little bit more relaxed in control, in decision making, and more trusty maybe of your partner who has built up years of experience in a field where, as a pharma company, you're now trying to enter. And I think that is one of the key things which is very difficult to instill in a partnership from the beginning, but it begins and falls with trying to build that relationship of mutual understanding, and unfortunately I've seen it fail many times.
It helps if you've got if you can get a bit of an auction going because you've got something that others don't have. So in the case of IFM being bought by Bristol Myers Squibb, Merck and Novartis had STING agonists and Bristol Myers didn't. So the sense of must have. And that helps. I mean, that wasn't cell and gene therapy, but it helps in any context.
We have another question here.
There seem to be so many ways in which this business is different from the traditional white pill or injectable biological market. Have you given consideration to the way in which the commercial model will evolve, and in particular, what are life cycles going to be like? Are they going to be much, much longer or much, much shorter? I have no idea.
It depends, because it depends on your setting within cell and gene therapy. I'll give you two examples which will give a different answer to your question. In the gene therapy setting, where often in these slowly progressing recessive disorders, the endpoints are hard, and what patients care about is that A, that it works, and B, it lasts a long time. If you're first in that setting, especially if it's an orphan, someone following you will never have the long-term follow-up data that you have. Yours will always be longer, and will struggle to beat your efficacy bar, so may not even get past your exclusivity. So there, if you're first to market, you've got a very good chance of being locked and loaded and owning it. You take the car situation, I think it's different. I think you're already seeing people making incremental improvements, constantly innovating that space, and the number of CD19s out there to be best in class. And so I think the actual innovation cycle in the CAR therapy will be relatively quick, and those companies are going to have to run hard and fast all of the time.
And you see companies setting themselves up that way, don't you? And it's quite interesting watching the companies with slightly more foresight in there, saying, we are planning for a short, particularly in the CAR-Ts, we're planning for a short product life cycle. So we are setting up our manufacturing and our capabilities and our supply chains to keep moving different products through.
Yeah. Exactly that, and I think that on the CAR side, so the autologous cell therapy side, it's ripe for a number of key players, because once the fourth person set up the infrastructure, the barrier to a fifth company setting up the infrastructure is so high. So I think you will have a number of companies, but not very many, that have the infrastructure to deliver, and the goal for them is to have a really big pipeline to plough through that infrastructure, so there'll be natural aggregators in the field.
Does anybody else want to comment on the life cycle? No? Peter, were you going to ask a question, or were you just shuffling? No? Okay, good. Right. A couple of minutes left now, and it's prediction time. Okay? So, as we did last year, and as we do every year, we've come here, we've looked back over the last year, and it's been if you go back to the temperature check analysis, things are warm. It's nice, but they're not necessarily feverish, and that's a healthy thing. So I'm going to go down the line and ask you to answer the question of. You can answer a different question if you want, but it's your last comments. But the question I'm going to ask is when we're sitting here in a year's time, what are we going to be saying about what's happened in the next year? Okay. Chris?
In a year's time, what are we saying?
Well, you can go further.
Yeah, so
let's just look forward a bit. We've done a lot of looking back.
So the key challenge ahead of us in the next 12 months is reimbursement structure, payment, and we're going to have some real frontline battles on that, especially with Spark and the price they're talking about. So we're going to have that data. So I think that on that issue, both companies and payers will be bloodied and bruised by this time next year, and I'll be predicting the 12 months following we will actually get to a resolution of what that will look like. I think technically within the field, what we would... To get a gene therapy into the eye, which is a small compartment and a compartment in those patients that is non-functional, I think is one thing. To get a gene therapy that addresses a central tissue and is more systemic, approved, or to BLA, I think would be a huge milestone, with the vectors probably being the most likely. And given that data, I'd expect that to be positive as well. So that would be my prediction. I'm predicting systemic gene therapy.
Okay, when you say central tissue, I predict we're going to see a huge upsurge in gene therapies for CNS. Mm-hmm. And there are different vectors that you can use today, AAV9, but new ones being Regenex Bio, 4D Molecular, and so on. And you've also got great tissue promoters. You've got Simpromics and others that have got these great artificial promoters to get the gene expression. So it won't just be monogenic diseases. It will be Alzheimer's. There will be ways people will want to get genes into the brain to see if they can treat Alzheimer's. That, I think, will be a huge new wave. I don't know if it'll be the next 12 months, but it's coming.
No, we like the music. Yeah. Paolo?
Yeah, for sure, I agree, but that brings back to the problem of sustainability and the reaction of the public sector to the NHS to the new product that will come to the market, and how. Again, also as it is also a matter of protocols of how this new product will be delivered, I think that this aspect will be key and fundamental in the next years, and so that will drive because it's still on the regulatory side, we know that products are coming. But then how they will be included and how will be used by physicians and caregivers. That's an aspect that will be fundamental, as well as the reimbursement in the next 12 years.
Jasper?
Yeah, I think in the next 12 months you will see more or less an hour of the truth, in the sense that you will have CAR-Ts that will actually be going way beyond what people were thinking a few years back. I mean, way to approval is super fast. Mm-hmm. That will also actually allow markets to maybe reset a little bit and to see. So we'll see whether the valuations that are currently for these kind of companies, whether these are actually realistic. So I think that's one of the key things. And For the rest, we've seen a few IPOs on gene therapy companies, already alluded to by Genghis. I think we will see a lot in terms of CNS, in terms of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, a few other CNS disorders, because that seems to be now much more tractable than it used to be.
That's really exciting. So I'm out of time, so I'll just very briefly summarise what I think I've heard. I think I've heard that there's plenty of substrate in Europe in particular to invest in, and there's a whole new wave coming forward with the CNS and the likes. I think I've heard that the market's active and lively, but not necessarily overheated. May have overheated. There may be a little bit of a correction coming up. We'll see what happens. The news has been good. People brought out good news stories about the last year, not necessarily the bad ones. Due diligence process is still as deep and as difficult as it always was, and people are getting better at it, getting practiced at it, and have got resources to do it. And there might emerge one day the European investing model which competes with the big brave American model. So my last job really is to thank the audience for their participation, but also to thank the panel. So if you'll join me, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to me.